Last fall, Stanzi and I took a couple of days and got away to Long Island. We got away to did someone just scoff at that? Did you? We were on a lovely, wonderful beach house in Long Island. It was a delightful, wonderful time. A couple days away, it was truly great. It was very, very nice. There was this wonderful deck area. It had a fire pit, and so at night we would go out and enjoy the glory of the stars and all the things you often can't see when you're on the city and the light pollution, and just look up at the sky. And one night we were out there, we had a fire going, and I looked up at the sky, and all of a sudden I saw something in the night sky I've never seen before. I saw this trail of lights that was far enough away that it was clearly something that was in outer space. And it was just strung together, these lights, one after the next, moving forward at this clear, direct pace, like just a string of pearls being gently dragged through the night sky. I'd never seen anything like it. It brought me to this moment of just utter shock and awe, because I looked at it and went, I don't know what that is, but I also looked at it and went, I don't know how I can find out what that is. I was like, I don't know if anyone knows what that is. I've never seen or heard of absolutely anything like that. And it was funny because my mind sort of started jumping to like mythological explanations. I was like, I think that's what Santa's sleigh would look like if it were sprinting through the night sky. They're all in the line, and there's a lot more reindeer than I thought, but I think I might be. It was like November, and I was like not seriously entertaining that, but I was like, what else could it be? Honestly, what else could it be? And I was just floored in that moment with, honestly, a sense of awe and wonder that is so rare in the world today, because not only did I look at something in the material world and go, I don't know what that is, but I thought, I have no reference for what that could possibly be. Well, unfortunately, I pulled out my phone and Googled it, and we can owe that whole experience to Elon Musk and the launch of the Starlink satellites. This is what they look like when they get launched in the sky. And it's really a wild experience to see them, but they travel through the sky, and I just stood silent and watched them until they passed all the way out of the horizon. It was shocking, but I opened up my phone and I was like, okay, it's the Starlink satellite launch that happened to be over the Hudson Valley area at the time. Now, this feeling of awe that I had around this experience, like I said, is really so rare in the modern world, because not only have we really uncovered a vast majority of the mysteries that exist in understanding how our physical material world operates, but we've done that to such an extent that we now have a significant amount of confidence that if we don't know something, we'll be able to figure it out. And this actually poses a profound question for us in faith, because for many times and places throughout history and geography, as people have related with the divine throughout history and throughout the world, there's always been some category for understanding God as being responsible for physical, material causes that exist in the world. What happens to our faith when we don't need God to explain what's happening in the material world anymore? Does that influence our faith in any way? If we look around at the world and go, we can actually explain this whole show without God, it seems. What becomes of our faith if we don't need God to explain things that we see in the world anymore? We're in the middle of a sermon series titled, Why Does It Feel Like God Isn't Real? And in this sermon series, what we're trying to do is sort of serve a ministry of location and understanding. We're trying to locate ourselves in our time and place and learn about the conditions of faith that we live in now and what it means for what it's like to have faith in the time that we live in. Not every expression of faith is the same in different times and places. And in some times and places, faith can be easier, and in some times and places, faith can be more difficult. And in our time and place, I've argued last week that there are some conditions that can make faith very difficult. We looked last week at Isaiah chapter 37 and King Hezekiah, and we looked at the idea of the secular as a word that describes the conditions of faith that exist in our time. And last week we looked at how King Hezekiah had something in his world that was influencing the conditions of faith in his own day. There was a physical army at his doorstep that posed a significant challenge to his faith. It made faith in his God very difficult to believe that God would save him when there was this huge army at the doorstep of Jerusalem. And we don't have physical armies that are posing challenges to our faith in the same way today, but in our world, in our time, we have had ideas that have marched through history, that have created a context of faith, that have at times made faith more difficult. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to unfold two or three of what those ideas are. We're going to look at one of those ideas today. It's called the disenchantment of the world. This is what we're going to be looking at today. And as we look at this, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. I'd encourage you to open up a Bible to Genesis. We've got Bibles in the back there that you can have and take them home. Would love for you to have a Bible. You can open up a device, whatever you'd like. Again, we're in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. If you're not familiar with the Bible, today's your lucky day, because Genesis is the first page. And we're on the first page of the first page. We're right there at the beginning. You can't miss it. Just right at the beginning. Get past the index, get past the table of context, and boom. Genesis, right there. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. I'll read the text out. Oh, and by the way, before I do, if you have questions that are coming up for you during the sermon, you can text them to 201-308-3774. You can text questions to this, and we're going to be producing some other sort of supplemental materials like teaching stuff and some conversations in the community and question stuff to just round out our teaching about these things. And one of the things we want to do is be able to field questions from people and speak to them. So if you have questions that come up for you, you can pull out your phone, you can text this number, and we'll have something that's coming out in the next couple months where we'll be engaging with these questions in sort of a question-and-answer format. So feel free to text those things. Again, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. This is what the text says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. The modern world that we live in doesn't need God to explain material causes. The modern world doesn't need God to explain material causes. The Bible here, in these opening verses, argues that God is responsible for the existence of material reality. So we see this right at the beginning. The earth is formless and void, but then God speaks, and the first thing he says is, "Let there be light." He creates a foundational part of physical reality as we know it, energy, light. And then, of course, he does this with creating water and earth and dry land and everything and matter, and he speaks and creates the dimensions of our physical existence. Now, there's a question here about whether or not God actually did this with pre-existent matter, or if it's ex nihilo. The Christian tradition has always said that God created matter out of nothing. So, for example, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, the text says, "By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible." In other words, that God is responsible for the whole show of matter in the material physical world as we know it. And so we see in the Bible a view that God created matter, that God can influence matter. If you pray to God for something in the material world, God's powerful and able to influence it. And this accorded well with generally a view that people had in the ancient or the pre-modern world about spiritual causation as it pertained to physical realities. About spiritual causation as it pertained to physical realities. In other words, generally speaking, and this took different forms in different times and places and cultures, but generally speaking, people in a pre-modern worldview and an ancient worldview might have seen a change happen in the physical world, and they would have maybe thought a spirit did that was a reasonable explanation. Do you see what I'm saying? That obviously is very different from the world that we live in today. Even if we think that God is able to do that, it's not our assumption. We assume something else. Oh, that had a material cause. But in the ancient world, people might have seen something happen in the physical world, and they would have gone, a spirit did that. This happened in a number of different ways. For example, with weather patterns. If you are in the middle of a storm, maybe you thought that because the storm god was storming, and that's why there's a storm. And maybe it's in the Greco-Roman world, Zeus, or in the ancient Near Eastern world, it's Baal. They're both basically nature storm gods, and it's storming because the storm god is storming, and the lightning bolts of the storm god throwing the lightning bolts down to the ground, right? This might have happened with, say, special objects. Maybe your life's going fine, and then something really bad happens to you. You might, in this worldview, go, "Hey, so-and-so gave me that weird gift last week. I wonder if that weird gift is imbued with some sort of bad spiritual energy. And maybe that has done something bad in my life," right? We wouldn't think about that in the same way today, but that's another way in the pre-modern world that would have happened. It might have functioned around certain places, right? Don't wander near the forest with your small children, because if your small children get lost, fairies might steal them in the forest, right? There are all sorts of ways that this played out. Now, it's obvious in our lives that we don't live in the same way anymore. Yes, there might be some exceptions as we think about God's ability to intervene in the world, but generally, we check an app to figure out what's going to happen with the weather. We don't go, the weather god's storming, and so the storm is coming, right? We check an app. We're like, hey, we can read this thing in terms of material causes and predict with reasonable certainty what's going to happen with the weather. We don't think that gifts are cursed. Generally, I don't know, maybe you've gotten a gift that you're like, they gave me that for some bad reason, or what are they trying to say to me by giving me that gift? But generally, we don't think something bad happened in my life because I have a cursed object in my house. And, we grabbed the forest and flipped it upside down and shook it really hard, and there were no fairies in there, right? So all these things are very, very different. And we would talk about this through the language of saying that our world, our material world at the level of causes has been disenchanted. There's a conversation that has been famously recorded. It might be apocryphal, but there's probably some historical truth here between Napoleon and the French politician and mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace. And Laplace had this large mathematical system that explained sort of the whole of reality. And Napoleon comes up to Laplace and is like, I'm very interested by what you're saying, but I wonder, where is God in your theory? And Laplace famously replies, Sir, I have no need of that hypothesis. Sir, I have no need of that hypothesis. Right? And the feeling here isn't that Laplace is saying, well, God isn't real. He's just saying, I don't need God to explain the material world. It's just kind of irrelevant as a hypothesis. This idea is called disenchantment, the disenchantment of the world, the removal of spiritual forces for material causes in the world. And it's a powerful idea that can make faith hard in our time and place. If God isn't needed to explain anything about how we experience in the world, where is he? If God isn't needed to explain anything in how we experience the world, why does God matter? And it can just sort of feel, when we think about God declining in our ability to explain the world through the idea of God, that idea that God's getting pushed out of the world can make us just sort of feel like God's kind of in decline. Right? It can make us feel like faith is in decline and faith is unreasonable. And the force of this impacts everyone. Some people it impacts explicitly. Some people are people of faith, some sort of religious faith, Christians, and then they engage with all the literature out there about physical material causes in the world, and they go, gosh, I really don't need God to explain the world, and they lose their faith. Even, however, if this idea is not affecting us in an explicit way, it affects us implicitly. It can create just a weaker faith context generally. And then when we stumble across something else that makes our faith hard, it doubles up on the idea that God kind of felt irrelevant already in the world that I lived in the way that I understood it. So this is a really important idea for understanding why faith can feel hard in the modern secular world that we live in. These things work themselves out in people's lives. Now, with this idea of disenchantment, let's look at it for a second. There are two major sources for this idea in the history of the Western world. One of them is kind of obvious, and the other is actually quite surprising. The kind of obvious source is our increasing ability to explain the world in terms of physical material causes and our increasing technological control over the world. This is one source for the idea that our world is becoming disenchanted. So arguably, probably the most influential sociologist of the 20th century was a German guy named Max Weber, and he coins the term disenchantment in one of his vocation lectures. This is the famous quote from this lecture. He says this: increasing rationalization and intellectualization does not, in other words, mean a greater general knowledge of the conditions we live under. Rather, it means something else, the knowledge or belief that we could find out if we wanted to. That in principle, there are no mysterious, incalculable forces intervening in our lives, but instead, all things in theory can be mastered through calculation. It means the disenchanting of the world. Do you see what he's saying here? He's saying here, the condition that's changed actually isn't the fact that we know everything. It's that we feel like we can. And so we encounter everything in the world and go, wait, there's almost nothing that we encounter. But this is why my experience with the Starlink satellite thing is really rare. Because that sort of moment where we encounter something and go, I don't know what that is, and I don't know if I can find out. That is an experience that we almost never have anymore in a world that's disenchanted. We go, I don't know what that is, but I can probably figure it out, and it's got a material cause. This obviously is one sense in the modern world, in one trajectory that created this sense of disenchantment. There's a second major source of disenchantment, however, in the modern world, and it's very surprising. It's the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is the second major source in the modern world for disenchantment, because the faith of the God of the Bible, the way it's described in the Bible, the way it's taught, is a disenchanted faith when compared to the religion of Israel's ancient Near Eastern neighbors. Let me say that again. It's a disenchanted faith when compared to the religions of Israel's ancient Near Eastern neighbors. Israel's neighbors, the religions that they had, all of their gods were nature gods. They lived already within a physical material system. And so you worship those gods so that they would influence the realm of material causes. And because they were physical gods, you would do stuff in the physical to manipulate them in order to working on the world. The God of the Bible, over and over again, is trying to get the people of Israel to leave that whole model of thinking behind. The God of the Bible says, I created the material world. I'm able to interact with the material world, but I am not primarily a vending machine for various causes in the material world. And stop relating to me that way. The God of the Bible is saying that to the people of Israel over and over and over again. This is why he says, don't make an idol of me, because I'm not a material God. So you cannot represent me with materiality. This is why he says, do not practice magic and divination, because I'm not a material reality, so you cannot manipulate me through material reality. This is why even in the creation accounts, there's a disenchantment of faith, because if we were to read the rest of the creation account, all of nature is described as nature. None of it is described whatsoever as divinized. The sun, the moon, the stars, they're just sun, moon, stars. They're not gods. Over and over again, the God of the Bible is trying to say, I created matter. I'm able to reach in and do things in the material world, but I am not a material God. Stop viewing me as a vending machine for material causes. Now, there's a historical story that goes through the Reformation and through the creation of deism that helps us to see how these currents really got all the way into the society that we live in. We don't have time for that today, but I'm hoping to address it in a teaching that I might put together as a part of this whole thing. But the main point I want to make is that one of the major drivers for disenchantment in the modern world is actually the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible knows that we are overrun by our experience of the physical world, by the things that we experience with our senses and see with our eyes, and so we're prone to identify God with what we can physically see. And from the beginning, God has been trying to distinguish himself from that so that we can see him and his immaterial reality with our spirits and with our souls. Because while our time feels disenchanted because the modern world no longer needs God to explain material causes within our physical reality, the God of the Bible has been trying to get people to understand from the beginning that it is the immaterial dimensions of our physical reality and not the material dimensions that actually need explanation. It's the immaterial dimensions of our physical reality and not material causes that actually need explanation. Look at this with me. When we think about God creating the world, we focus on the material dimension. God created matter. God created the material. But in Genesis, in our text today, there's actually 3 M's that God created. The first is the material, but there's a second one, morality, a moral dimension that God imbued into creation when he put it together. Look with me at Genesis chapter 1, verse 4. Right? Starting in verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. He saw that it was good. We are so used to moral language that we just assume that it should be part of any old reality. But it would be very natural to describe this and just saying, God created light, blah, 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 and he saw the light and saw that it existed. He saw that it was. But to say saw that it was good is to say that he imbued that light, that dimension of our physical material reality with a category of valuation, with a good category. Look at this. This is wild. The Bible is just so insightful about reality. Compare with me Genesis 1:31 with Exodus 39:42 to 43. And I have a slide for these so you don't have to flip to it in your Bibles. Compare with me these two texts. This is what Genesis 1:31 says about the end of creation. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now compare with me what Moses says about the finishing of his work when he's done constructing the tabernacle. According to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so the people of Israel had done all the work. And Moses saw all the work, and behold, they had done it. As the Lord commanded Moses, so they had done it. God bless Moses, working his butt off in the flesh to please God and create this people, does all this work, and all he's able to say is, it's done. But God, working in the power of the Spirit, makes something and gets done and says it's good. And those are two totally different things. We talk and live and think in the moral dimension all the time in our world. We just assume that it should be part of our reality because we've woken up to it. But there is no reason why a material reality should somehow take on a moral dimension. It's something that needs to be explained. And so while our world might be disenchanted of the realm of material causes, it's really not at all disenchanted at the realm of moral causes and our physical world's ability to participate in a moral dimension. And in fact, even societally, there's really no sense whatsoever that we're going to be living in a disenchanted moral world anytime soon. Because it seems at the same time that as the disenchantment of God in the realm of physical material causes has increased, the disenchantment has increased, so God's been removed from them, our sense of moral feeling just grows and grows and grows. Right? We live in a time that is hot with moral feeling. Everyone wants to be good, everyone thinks they're right, and everyone wants to work for the good in their lives. Our society in some way is kind of obsessed with the morally enchanted dimension of our physical world. No one wants to live in Exodus 39. No one wants to look at their life and say, I built that and it's done. Everyone wants to live in Genesis 1. I built that and it was good. Why, though? Why do we do that? This needs some sort of an explanation. Why it is that we should ever see the physical as good or beautiful or valuable. And this actually is a really difficult question to answer, and I'll just sprint through this very quickly. If you are conversant in philosophy and the way these questions try to be answered, locating goodness in anything other than some sort of external reality ends up boiling goodness down to my emotions or my feelings or societal norms. It's really a very difficult question to answer. And indeed, major thinkers like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche have noticed that if there's no God, it kind of looks like everything's permissible. There's no moral realm at all. While a few people in certain contexts, mostly academic, are sort of fine with talking about the moral dimension as sort of a convenient human fiction, most of us want to live in a physical world that's filled with moral enchantments. We want to be able to talk about things that are good. We want to be able to talk about things that are beautiful. We want to be able to talk about things that are valuable and to have those statements mean something real and not just be fictions. I was walking through an unnamed grocery store the other day, and I went to buy eggs, and when I went to open the egg freezer, this image was on the egg freezer. There we are. Egg fridge. Yeah. Frozen eggs would be strange. The egg fridge, right? This image was on the egg fridge, right? And what they were telling you with this image is that all of the eggs that are sold at this grocery store are better than cage-free. They're ethically better than cage-free, right? So you look at this, you're like, cage-free plus outdoor access, pasture-raised, outdoor living. You feel like there's supposed to be a fifth one here with a picture of like a chicken reclining with their feet up and a cigar in their mouth, being like, all our chickens have a retirement plan. 5% of your purchase today contributes to this chicken's 401k, right? You look at this and you're like, this is an artifact of a very moral society. This is an artifact of a society that cares deeply about being good. But the question is, why is it that having chickens inside a place or outside of place is moral at all? You could describe that as just saying, those chickens are in a building. Those ones are out of building. Why is one good and why is one not good? It's actually hard to account for, but nobody cares about giving an account for it. We just recognize that this is moral, and we're very passionate about it. And so we pay more to buy eggs that are more moral. We're paying for morality. We're paying to participate in the moral dimension of our physical realm. I know that joke too. My wife stands me by the way. I took the picture. I knew where this was going, but she was like, there should be a retirement image for the chicken. So my wife's a very funny person with a great sense of humor, and it's really her joke. So, while our physical world is disenchanted at the realm of material causes, it's not at all disenchanted in terms of the way that we participate in the moral dimension. But God created a third M. He imbued a third M into creation, not just the material, not just the moral, but the meaningful. God created a dimension of meaning that our physical universe can participate in. Look with me in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. God created a dimension of meaning, by which I'm sort of referring to the idea that when something is brought into relationship with something else, a web of relationships, it can somehow come to have a significance that it didn't have on its own. And God did this with light. Right? What is a day? What's a day? Don't tell me it's 24 hours, because that's just our descriptive measurement for how we've fictionalized time as seconds and minutes and whatever. And right, actually, if you look into it, a day's not really 24 hours, right? We're always fiddling with that last second, right? Or like a year. We're always fiddling with the last second then on the year. The clock just doesn't quite add up. So don't tell me it's 24 hours. A day is a meaningful unit of time. That's what a day is. And we have different ways in which we notate different meaningful units of time. Like a day is a meaningful unit of time. But like, what do we call 4 days? We call it 4 days. That's not a meaningful unit of time to us. But 7 days is. That's called a week. And this can differ from cultures, right? Because for us, what do we call 2 weeks? There we go. Some of you are from cultural context where you're familiar with the uses of the fortnight. But most of us aren't. We just call it 2 weeks. But there are other cultures that say 2 weeks is a meaningful period of time. We call that a fortnight. And a month is a meaningful period of time. These are meaningful periods of time. And God creates a dimension of meaning where he takes the raw physical reality light and brings it into another specific relationship with the reality darkness. And once they're brought into this relationship, they transcend their basic physical realities and begin to participate in a meaningful reality where now they no longer exist just as light or darkness. They exist as day and night. Meaningful time. We talk and live and exist and assume the existence of this meaningful dimension. If our lives don't feel meaningful, if they don't exist within a web of relationships that take them beyond the physical and into the realm of meaning, purpose, significance, something, then we can have everything else. Beauty, money, success, everything. And still feel like life might not be worth living. So people are searching today, right? And there's a popularization of searching for meaning in different spiritual searches through astrology apps. I owe everything in this sermon to my wife. Sandy tells me that you can go into some large-scale clothing retailers and buy tarot cards there now. People are looking, right, for spiritual resources to make sense of their lives. But where do you go if you don't go to popular spirituality? Even then, in, say, secular thought of people where people really, at the end of the day, all the way down at the bottom of their philosophy, they'd say, meaning isn't really real. People even in those spaces are recognizing that it seems like humans need a sense of meaning to live. They need it. And so there are people who, even though they think that meaning is sort of a convenient fiction, they're writing about how to help people have that fiction to make their life meaningful. There's a book that came out a couple months ago. Everything you need to know is in the title. The Re-Enchantment of the World, Secular Magic in a Rational Age. The Re-Enchantment of the World, Secular Magic and Rational Age. A bunch of philosophers at a prestigious university came together to contribute to this. One of them, in an essay titled Modern Magic, says that we need illusions in order to make it through the brute reality of a meaningless world. He says, what we need in response is not a mechanism for seeing through illusions, but quite the contrary, a technique for producing and sustaining them. He goes on to say that art, poetry, novels, drama, can provide this and are, I quote, training grounds for lucid self-delusion. Now, I actually want to be really charitable towards this perspective, because this is someone who, on the basis of their worldview, is trying to offer people resources to feel like their life is meaningless meaningful in a meaningless world. And I want to be really charitable towards that. But it would be really reasonable if someone looked at that and said, that feels a lot to me like kind of lying. Like maybe what we just need to do is face the facts and say our lives are meaningless. And that we should disenchant our world at the level of meaning. But it's basically impossible to imagine ourselves being able to do this, because even in our language, we speak at the level of meaning. We don't speak at the level of the material. We speak at the level of meaning, right? If we were to try to speak in our language, no longer at the level of meaning, we would stop saying things like, hey, how was your day yesterday? Because that sentence trades on the idea of a meaningful unit of time. We wouldn't say that anymore. We would say things like, hey, how was it for you in that past stretch of time when last the lights were on in the sky? That's what it would that's what it would look like to disenchant our language at the level of meaning. And even what I just said is kind of anthropocentric, right? We would need to disenchant it to another level. It's something more like, hey, how was it for you in that past stretch of time when last our water orb rotated such that it faced the burning fire orb? We're never going to do this. We're never going to. We're going to continue to speak and live at the dimension of meaning because we have to. There's just something going on in what it means to be a person that needs meaning. We need something more than raw, brute materiality. And so our world really isn't all that disenchanted at all. While it may be disenchanted at the level of physical causes, which again is a level that God has been trying to disenchant for us for some time, it's not at all disenchanted on the moral level and the level of meaning. Our physical world is actually full of the enchantments of morality and meaning. Our world is full of things that aren't just things. They're beautiful things. They're good things. They're inspiring things. They're meaningful things. They're things that are somehow more than the sum of their parts. Like that. The question is, why? Why? How do we account for these things? Sure, maybe they're fictions. They're things that humans make up to make life bearable for as long as we're conscious on this dying rock. Or maybe they exist because they're signs. Maybe they're signs of another world, an enchanted world, a world that touched our reality at the moment of its creation and as a result filled it up with signs of its existence. Maybe our perception of a moral dimension in this world persists because it's a sign of a world where goodness is written into the very fabric of its reality, where right and justice are simply the order of the day. Maybe we continue in this world to create meaningful units of time because they're signs of another world where all time is meaningful. Something that we might use the language of eternity to describe. And we keep creating units of meaningful time in this world because we long for a world where all time is meaningful. The Bible says that such a world exists, and it says that it is called the kingdom of God. Our physical world is enchanted with immaterial dimensions because it is a sign of the enchanted world of God. God created a physical reality with immaterial dimensions, enchantments, not willy-nilly, not because it was just some great idea he had, but because he wanted to create a world that was a sign and a reflection of his own world, of his own reality that he dwells in. We see a glimpse of some of this. I obviously can't work all of this out because no one's ever gone to heaven and gotten a complete glimpse there. But we've got little pieces parts, and one of them is in Revelation chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 8. This is what John the Revelator says. He says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven with one seated on the throne. And day and night those surrounding him never ceased to say, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come.'" Even in this picture, we see two elements of the reality of the life of God that are the sources for the things that we see in our world that are a sign of these things. Our moral dimension is a sign of the utterness, of the utter... Does utterness mean? Of the... what was I even trying to say? Otherness, there it is. Of the utter otherness. Of God, who's holy and set apart. And when we see in this world a moral dimension, what we're doing is seeing a side that points to a world where things are utterly different because God is utterly different. When we see meaningful units of time in this world, they're reflections of the eternally meaningful existence of God, who was and is to come, past and present and future. God imbued the enchantments of morality and meaning in our physical world as signs of these realities in the life of God. The signs are there. We just need to be able to see them. We just need help seeing them. And this really is the age-old challenge, because it is just so hard for us in this world to see the things of God. We are just bombarded by the physical. The physical's good. I'm not talking about some spirit good, physical bad thing. The physical's good, but it just takes up all of our space. It's so hard to then set that aside and say, there's something non-physical that I'm crying out for, but I can't see it. So how do I give it my attention? Or even things like morality and meaning. They're almost too close to us for us to recognize what they really are. They feel like parts of everyday life, but they're not. They're signs of a different world, but they just feel so normal. And so it's so hard for us to see, being physical creatures as we are, the things of God. And God knows this. And this is why God was so kind to not just put spiritual signs in our physical world, of his world, but to take the spiritual realities of his world and put them into a body. Put them into flesh. Put them into a physical reality. So that when we see God's Son, Jesus Christ, God's Spirit, flesh, Son, we can see with our own eyes and in our own physical realm the spiritual things of God. This is what the Gospel of John says in John chapter 1, verse 14. "And the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst, and we have seen him." We've seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. In order to see in our world, in our time, where it can be hard to see the things of God, we need revelation. We need God to reveal them to us. We need God to open our eyes. Look, our world really isn't that disenchanted. Our physical world is still full of the enchantments of morality and meaning. We just need God's revelation to help see these things. So, if we were to bring this back to this original question, what does having faith mean in an age of disenchantment? Is faith more difficult? Well, maybe in some ways. Certainly, we could argue that there are some things that are more difficult about having faith in a disenchanted time because God's pushed out of the realm of the material causes and so much of our life is material. Certainly, that adds a degree of difficulty. At the same time, faith in this time has a particular spiritual opportunity. And it's a spiritual opportunity to cry out to God for revelation. That he would open our eyes to the spiritual things that are already here so that we can see them. Right? Every age, every time has elements that lend itself to certain spiritual realities and certain spiritual experiences. Last week we looked at the secular and how that cries out for salvation. Living and having faith in a time of disenchantment cries out for revelation, where we cry out to God. Not that we say, God, I need to know more, right? We live in a time where we're just in a glut of information. If only I knew more about God. It's not about that. If only I did more. It's not about that. If only I cried out to God to open my eyes for revelation, that I can see the things of God that are present in this world already. That's the opportunity for faith in a disenchanted time. That we would cry out to God to open our eyes so that we can see God's presence already now in this time and this place.